What contempt Gerald L.K. Smith must have for the intelligence of the American people.
This classic line appeared on the 4th of June, 1948, in the Des Moines Tribune at Des Moines, Iowa. Ladies and gentlemen, what are people in all sections of the nation saying about our own and the world's great issues and problems? That is what this program tells you by bringing you direct editorial quotations from those living monuments to our democratic way of life, America's daily newspapers.
In an editorial headed, "Not This Dribble Again," the Des Moines Tribune says Gerald L.K. Smith is peddling dollar reprints of that hoary hoax, The Prodigals of the Learned Elders of Zion. It purports to be the minutes of a secret conference held in 1896 by the authorities of international Jewry to plot a campaign to rule the world by a process of degeneration, destruction, and enslavement. Now, actually, it is a rewrite of a Republican political tract published in 1865 and again in 1868, attacking not the Jews, but Napoleon III, the Emperor of France. This monstrous plagiarism has been known to the world ever since the London Times published the whole evidence in 1921. The utter absurdity of the so-called Jewish plot has been obvious to anyone who really knew anything about Jewish life ever since the phony Prodigals were published in 1905. What contempt Gerald L.K. Smith must have for the intelligence of the American people.
Anytime you feel like starting a lively debate, which is quite likely to develop into a red-hot argument before you're through, all you have to do is to mention the magic word, or rather one of the magic words. There are a number of them right now. Two that pop into mind almost at once are John L. Lewis and Henry A. Wallace. Almost everyone has an opinion on Mr. Lewis and Mr. Wallace, and these opinions are usually pretty violent. Either you like Mr. Lewis and or Mr. Wallace, or you don't. Well, the main difference between newspaper editors and anybody else is that the editors get a chance to air their opinions in print. So let's see what they're saying. We'll take Mr. Lewis first.
To the St. Joseph, Missouri News Press, Judge T. Allen Goldsboro is the man of the hour because, says the News Press in its timely observations column, the judge stopped John L. Lewis when Lewis's battle for labor turned out to be nothing more than an exhibition of selfish pomposity. John L. had a lot of people buffaloed, including some of his own miners. But worst of all, he seemed to be beginning to enjoy his ability to command the fate of not only his own miners, but that of the nation. Lewis's latest scheme was his refusal to bargain with a single representative for 14 coal operators. The refusal would have presented a convenient stalemate until the miners' contract expires on June 30th. Then Lewis would have been dictator of these United States once again. Said Judge Goldsboro, certainly it's unreasonable for the union to say we're entitled to one representative for 99 units, and the Southern Producers Association is not entitled to one representative for 14 associations. When the time comes that any movement undertakes to carry out its wishes by methods which ultimately disintegrate society, at that point it must stop. To which the editor adds a hearty amen.
After covering virtually the same points, the Portland Oregonian added,
there are no issues now involved except the validity of the new law and the court's action, which can be appealed to the Supreme Court, and what the paper calls John L. Lewis's bullheadedness. Now, the original pension issue has been compromised, says the Oregonian, and the government has no recourse but to make it a finish fight if the miners want it that way. The Providence, Rhode Island Journal said it agreed with the judge and charged that John L. Lewis is trying to break up the Southern Association so he may deal with the individual operators one at a time. And this, says the Journal, would constitute a complete turn of the tables from the days when unorganized workers had to make what individual terms they could with powerful, well-backed management. Today, those old labor management relationships are rightly regarded as morally and economically wrong and outdated. But, continues the Journal, the complete reverse of that one-sided situation would be no less wrong. And for that reason, Mr. Lewis's attempts to reach this goal should be resisted firmly, as they have been in this latest instance.
The Boise, Idaho Statesman goes a step farther.
It says it hopes Lewis is thrown into the clink as the criminal the court says he is. Anything less than a prison sentence, continues the Statesman, will amount to a concession by the government that it fears the reprisal of the miners. And it'll be a sad day in the morning when the government of the United States of America thus allows itself to be coerced into an unjust course of action by the threats of any organized minority, including the United Mine Workers. The Miami, Florida Herald sees the whole thing as political. Lewis is not always subtle, says the Herald, but he has never been more obvious than he was when he staged his long-awaited surrender as a benefit for the Republican Party. Coal will be welcomed again, whether it's Democratic or Republican. It all burns alike. Lewis's performance was a pretty cheap show, however, but typically Lewis. When one man can settle a national coal strike for political reasons, the country is in danger. Now, after a word from our announcer, we'll take up the very interesting subject of Henry A. Wallace.
The economic and political upheavals this country is experiencing now as a result of the war provides fertile ground for those who sow the seeds of racial and religious prejudice. Either through ignorance or indifference, many Americans these days are using the old scapegoat technique of blaming all modern-day difficulties on racial, religious, and other minority groups. It's a vicious practice, which, if allowed to develop, could divide and ruin this country far quicker and more thoroughly than any war. Particularly today, when international problems are so serious, division at home weakens the prestige of America and hampers efforts to secure world peace. We can all prevent this and at the same time hurry our own national recovery by fighting prejudice wherever we find it. Straighten out your friends who slander a whole group because of one petty personal dislike. Encourage respect of minority religions and races. Keep America great by promoting the racial and religious freedom that made it great. Now, let's see what they're saying about Henry Wallace.
The Hollywood Citizen News says, Plain Talk, a magazine which deals competently with the communist menace, heads its June issue with an article entitled, Who Runs Wallace? The opening sentence reads, The Communist Party conceived, initiated, formed, staffed, and controls from top to bottom the third party movement fronting Henry Aggard Wallace's bid for the White House. To back up this statement, the author, Victor Lasky, lists name by name and title by title the communists and pro-communists who run the organizations backing Henry Wallace for president. Anyone who reads the article will be convinced that the Communist Party and various parties backing Wallace are, in effect, one and the same. Now, what makes this situation of special interest to all Americans is that Henry Wallace is a former Vice President of the United States. Had he been renominated, he would now be President. And yet he is the man who is now acclaimed by those who place the interests of Russia ahead of the interests of the United States. One look at the subversive elements that are supporting the Wallace candidacy is enough to convince any sane person that another Wallace should never be slipped into such a high office as the Vice Presidency.
On the other side of the fence, the Los Angeles Daily News has this to say.
In Ohio, the Secretary of State has barred the Wallace for President party from the ballot under a section of state law which prohibits political parties or groups engaged in un-American activities from having a place there. This position seems to be one that represents exactly what Wallace's bitterest opponents charge him with seeking to make a regular program. Limiting the ballot to political parties that are regarded by those in power as entirely respectable is a sorry game to be playing in a democracy.
Getting off the subject of Henry Wallace, but not too far off, as you'll see in a moment, is an editorial from the San Francisco Chronicle. Says this newspaper,
The most comprehensive denunciation of the press that we have ever heard from any American quarter comes from Senator Glenn Taylor of Idaho, the third-party candidate for vice president. He says, The American press is the greatest villain ever to inhabit the face of the earth. Idaho's cowboy politician is a trifle free with his branding iron. Such a figure of speech would never have occurred to us, for we would find difficulty in personifying 1,700 daily and 10,000 weekly newspapers, their proprietors, editors, and reporters as one villain. The word is semantically vague anyhow. It means something in the theater, but suggests nothing indictable when applied to the assortment of idealists, busybodies, intellectuals, dopes, social critics, dreamers, civic disciplinarians, political manipulators, apathetic dividend gatherers, energetic fact-finders, and messiahs who make up the American press. Enough fundamentalism remains with us to support an early conviction that the antagonist in the Garden of Eden was the greatest villain ever to inhabit the face of the earth. We can think of some runners-up, but they are not editors or even senators. Sorry, but we haven't yet found the right word for Taylor of Idaho, though we may any day now.
Most editors agree rather wholeheartedly that President Truman's recent swing through the West was 100% political in nature. Among these are the editors of the Reno Evening Gazette, the San Antonio Express, and the Daily Oklahoman, published at Oklahoma City.
The Daily Oklahoman quotes the Congressional Quarterly as giving 3 answers to why the tour was declared by the president's advisors to be official.
1.
So the expenses could be paid by the federal treasury instead of the Democratic National Committee.
2.
To enable the president to avoid meeting the wrong leaders and fraternizing with the wrong factions.
3.
To free local candidates from becoming identified with a presidential candidate whose endorsement might be a handicap locally.
The Wyoming State Tribune says, however, that the president made friends in Cheyenne. Says the Tribune,
many Cheyennites and visitors from other towns and states welcomed Mr. Truman as President of the United States, not as a politician on a political junket.
much has been made of the revolt of the Solid South from Democratic ranks because of Mr. Truman's ideas on the racial question. In this connection, an editorial from the Laurel, Mississippi Leader Call is extremely interesting. Says this newspaper,
the Leader has never gotten very much steamed up over the race question that has loomed so large a part of the present state situation. The Democratic National Convention will surely endorse Truman's stand on that. Suppose we walk out of a convention because we disapprove of that one plank. Where shall we go? The Republicans are sure to have a similar plank, and no Mississippian can persuade himself that he'll be better off by voting GOP. Incidentally, the Colton, California Courier says most of the people incensed about the racial situation have never been in the South. This California paper says thinking Southerners are even more concerned with their problem than are the North and West. Given aid instead of criticism, they will go farther toward the answer. The real problem is one of individuals, says this editor, who advises us to try not to believe evil of any American, whether he's from the North or South, or whether he is black or white. Don't line yourself up on any side. Don't believe propaganda. It is this thing of taking sides without thinking for yourself that causes trouble. There are too many people trying to regulate the thinking of their brothers. We should mind our own thinking.
over on the Republican side of the picture,
The Fort Worth Star-Telegram says 9 Republican senators have banded themselves into a progressive bloc to oppose any lapse of the party into reaction or isolationism. This group will aim at adoption by the Republican National Convention of a forward-looking platform on foreign and domestic issues. These senators are listed as Ives of New York, Baldwin of Connecticut, Flanders of Vermont, Saltonstall and Lodge of Massachusetts, Tye of Minnesota, Smith of New Jersey, Noland of California, and Gurney of South Dakota. Now, as to the political fight itself, the Burbank Review advances the interesting theory that the 3 top contenders for the Republican nomination, Dewey, Taft, and Stassen, have just about knocked each other out of the running. As a consequence, the Review believes the final days between now and convention time will be marked by booming presidential guns for favorite sons and dark horses. Although both men deny a deal's been made, reports indicate that Governor Dewey and Senator Taft have now reached an off-the-record understanding to stop Stassen. Senator Vandenberg is considered their most likely choice if they are forced to put aside their own ambitions. Well, speaking of senators, did you ever hear of Senator Soper? Now, I've never figured out what state he's from, but he gets a lot of space in the newspapers. The editors, you know, are always quoting him, like the Portland Oregonian, which quotes him as saying, "Daytime radio in the barn increases the milk yield, and nobody knows exactly why, unless the cow just lets go, feeling that nothing matters." The Loudon, Iowa Tribune observes that the parents of a Cleveland infant who swallowed 3 dimes don't know whether to operate or drop in another dime and try for the jackpot. And the Colton Courier observes that the price of haircuts has come the nearest of anything to making it pay to be a poet or a musician.
that concludes today's issue of The Voice of a Nation, which tells you what American editors in every section of the country are saying today. Listen for the voice of your hometown paper. This is ABC, the American Broadcasting Company.